Tor House. Voices in the Granite. Looking closely at the stonework of Tor House, the original cottage stands in marked contrast to the buildings Jeffers built around it. The cottage expresses a rough, blocky style, whereas the surrounding buildings consist of larger, more rounded stones. Note the differences in workmanship. The cottage was made of relatively uniform stones, many of which had been cut to conform to the lines of the roof, the windows, the doors, and to other stones. This was the mark of an experienced stonecutter. Robinson Jeffers, in contrast, rarely cut stone, or at least he did his best to make it look that way. And his creations have an even more primitive, uncivilized, even expressionistic appearance than the original cottage. With Jeffers' stonework, the shape of almost every stone is preserved, painstakingly selected to match the lines of its neighboring stones. The effect is undeniably evocative, and it has so far stood the test of time. Since the tower's stonework was completed in 1924, about 10 stones have broken, but the tower still stands strong. Anyone can recognize the radical difference in style between the rough yet rationalist cottage and the pointedly savage, almost ruinous tower. The tower's large stones thrust out across the plane of each wall and impose their curves on the windows. A couple years after Robinson Jeffers completed his tower, he began to work on a dining hall that he would squeeze between the cottage and the garage. He completed the extension in 4 years. The design of the dining hall reveals a sort of dichotomy between the conformity of its lines and the massive unruliness of its stonework. It conforms to the lines of the cottage, the garage, and its own roof. Yet its bulging, uncut stones, one is tempted to say boulders, reveal it to be distinctly Jeffers. Its massive chimney is something of a signature. Though obedient to its domestic outlines, this dining hall seems even more massive and brutal than the tower. This is the last structure that Jeffers completed, and perhaps it is the most mature example of his stonework. The wealth of objects mortared into the interior walls of the dining hall, as well as the Joe Davidson bust of Jeffers that dates to the period that Jeffers worked on the hall, speak to Jeffers' fame at the time. During the final year that Jeffers spent building the dining hall, someone who would soon become a major figure in the lives of the Jeffers family arrived at Carmel, seeking to befriend Robin and Una by means of flattery and invitations to stay at her adobe mansion at Taos, New Mexico. Mabel Dodge Luhan was an heiress, a socialite, and a collector. She especially liked to collect poets. She had recently had a falling out with her poet D.H. Lawrence and was seeking to acquire a new house poet for Taos. Jeffers, with all of his gilded exposure in the magazines and literary reviews, was a prime candidate. Mabel rented a house across the road from the Jeffers property and got to work. Robin, Una, and their sons would visit Mabel in Taos on an annual basis until 1938, when Luhan's machinations, Robin's momentary infidelity, and Una's jealousy culminated in Una's very serious attempt at suicide. In one of the cabinets here, there is a small spherical object given by Mrs. Luhan to Una and Robin. It is purported to be some sort of Taos Indian talisman with magical properties. A superstitious person might have considered returning the object immediately to the nearest Taos Indian. Miraculously, Una survived and recovered from her attempt at self-annihilation. She would, however, fall ill to cancer after a couple of years, and cancer would torment her in waves for the final decade of her life. Electric outlets and lights throughout Tor House serve as a reminder of her demise, as it was only in her final days that Una would allow the fire of modernity into her house. Robin would miss Una terribly throughout his remaining years. Along with all the abalone in the soil, one also finds barnacles on the granite that these buildings are made from. Robinson Jeffers called it sea granite, for he mined it from the sea. Granite is a continental rock. It is never indigenous to the sea, though it makes a rather patriotic immigrant. The granite of Carmel Point is the same variety of granitic rock found atop Mount Whitney in Half Dome, two crown jewels of California's Sierra Nevada. How did all of this continental rock get to Carmel Point? It is important to note that Carmel Point is not merely on the coast, it is over 30 miles west of the San Andreas Fault. This could mean 30 miles offshore and under a lot of water, but Carmel Point sits high and dry because tectonic plate collisions can be very messy, characterized by heaps and heaps of debris. Part of the mass of wreckage from this collision is the granite that the Pacific Plate has scraped off the continent and dragged up the coast. If we were to give this great collision a name, we might call it California. This little community of buildings, built of barnacle-freckled Sierra Nevada sea granite on a pile of abalone shells, says California about as much as any man-made feature. The Jeffers twins turned 20 just about 7 years after their father had completed the dining hall. Soon thereafter, Robinson Jeffers began to work on a second Tor House, so that there would be a house for each of his sons to raise their families in. The new house would come to be called the East Wing. It was a big project, and work on it went slowly, and likely stalled at times. There were trips to New Mexico, Britain, and Ireland. There was a nationwide poetry recital tour. There was Una's attempted suicide and her long struggle against cancer. The twins moved home with their families in 1947, giving their father cause to complete the job, though his son Garth did not remain long after returning from the war. The crowded life in the attic may have played a part in Garth's decision to seek a second degree at Oregon State University. The building project was stopped in its tracks when Jeffers nearly died of pleurisy in 1948 while touring Britain and Ireland. Donnan, packed into the attic with his young family, took up the task of completing the house. The differences in skill, materials, ambition, and style between Donnan's work and his father's work are evident. The upper levels of the East Wing stonework consist of smaller, smooth river stones sunk into ample mortar. Except for one lower window, there are no lintels or arches above the first floor. The top of the second floor windows strike the roof line, giving the appearance of a job completed in haste, but a job completed nonetheless. For this, the slight accountant Donnan Jeffers earned the title of stonemason. Looking further back, the buildings of Tor House also represent the legacy of an old line of stonemasons. Robinson Jeffers, after all, had a teacher, Robert Pearson, who had been one of California's premier stonemasons. Pearson had learned the trade from his father, who had immigrated to Canada from England's Lake District. Pearson's father had apprenticed under his father, and so on. Robert Pearson left Canada for San Francisco and ultimately retired to Carmel by the sea. Robinson Jeffers and his son Donnan may rightly be seen as the last of the Pearson line of stonemasons. Tor House, in marking the end of the Pearson line, might also be taken to represent the end of an age of stone that gave way to an age of concrete, steel, electricity, and plastics. Schedule a tour of Tor House at torhouse.org. This independent presentation was produced in support of the Robinson Jeffers Tor House Foundation. The views expressed herein are not necessarily those of the Foundation. Your support for Tor House is appreciated.